Hi, this is Dave. Should a Christian business help the poor? Now, we know Christians are expected to be generous to the poor and the needy. And that message began in Old Testament commands to the Hebrews and continued consistently through the Bible to the end of the New Testament. Literally, I suppose hundreds of passages promote that message. So helping the poor is, for a Christian, is not an option. It's expected. But is that responsibility to help the poor and needy confined to individuals? Does a Christian business have a responsibility to help the poor and needy, separate and apart from that of the individuals who own, run, or work in that business? Well, it's a question I'm going to examine. I'd like for you to examine this with me today. First, a little bit of background. When I wrote the good book on business, I researched what the Bible had to say about business, and I uncovered the model for a Christian business. And in the Bible, it's called a household. The biblical household is an economic entity that consisted of family, slaves, servants, and employees under the direction of the head of the household. It has a presence and position above and beyond the collection of individuals who were employed by it, and was organized to accomplish some God-given task. In modern-day terms, the biblical household is a family business. Now, I realize that what I just said is probably new to a lot of people, and if you want to dig into it, again, I'm going to recommend the Good Book on Business. The Good Book on Business. You can get it wherever books are sold, Amazon and etc. Okay, but business, as manifested through the biblical household, had a major role to play from the very beginning of creation through the entire biblical narrative, including the establishment and propagation of the church in the New Testament. Let me repeat that because I think a lot of people don't understand that. Business, as manifested through the biblical household, had a major role to play from the very beginning of creation through the entire biblical narrative, including the establishment and propagation of the church in the New Testament. Most of the biblical businesses were agricultural. Abraham, for example, was a wealthy rancher, growing and selling grain, growing, processing, and selling wine, and raising livestock were common businesses, but not the only ones. Joseph, for example, was involved in food distribution. Bezalel was a custom jeweler. Jesus was a carpenter. Peter had a fishing business, and Paul made tents, to name a few. These are businesses. Just like today, there are some things that are business by virtue of its generally larger collection of manpower, assets, and resources can do that an individual cannot do. Now, there's some passages of Scripture regarding the poor that provide directions that can only be accomplished by a business. Here's two. Leviticus 19 and 10, and I'm quoting New American Bible. Likewise, quote, likewise you shall not pick your vineyard bare, nor gather up the grapes that have fallen. These things you shall leave for the poor and the alien. I, the Lord, am your God. This part of the law given to Moses is directed toward vineyard operations. It's pretty straightforward. At harvest time, leave the fruit that falls on the ground instead of picking it up. The needy and the stranger can then follow your pickers into the vineyard and help themselves to the grapes. Okay? Here's another one, Leviticus 23:22. Quote, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not be so thorough that you reap the field to its very edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. These things you shall leave for the poor and the alien. I, the Lord, am your God. Now, this is a very similar concept, but it's focused on a different business. If you're in the business of growing, processing, and selling grain, then you are to leave the corners of the fields unharvested as well as the gleaning so that those in need can help themselves to it. Now, these directions are part of the Mosaic Law, and so therefore they're not binding on Christians today, but nevertheless, they express a concept that modern Christian businesses may want to mimic. And I think there are four principles involved in these passages. So let's look at each of the four principles. Number one, the economics of your business should be such that a few percentage points less of raw material won't make a huge difference in your profit and loss. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. The economics of your business should be such that a few percentage points less of raw materials won't make a huge difference in your profit and loss. The grapes and the grain were the raw materials that would be processed into finished products. You ought to be able to absorb a little loss of raw materials. That's number one. Number two, the excess which was made available to the needy was of the raw materials, not the finished goods. So in other words, the passage did not recommend that extra wine be given, nor did it recommend that extra bread be given. It recommended the raw materials. So grain was usually threshed and ground and eventually baked into bread. Grapes were pressed and fermented and eventually made into wine. The finished goods from these operations were flour and wine. Now, the biblical passages do not direct the giving of finished goods, but only of the raw materials. In a sense, maybe this is why, in a sense, the raw materials were God-given, without the value-added benefit of human effort. You're making available a portion of the materials God has given to you. Okay, principle number 3. The needy had to harvest the produce themselves. The business owners were not told to harvest and give the produce to the needy, but rather to allow them an opportunity to harvest it themselves. In other words, the poor and the needy and the strangers and aliens had to work for it. Now, this tracks very neatly with a New Testament admonition, and I'm going to read 2 Thessalonians 3:10, quote, "In fact, when we were with you, we instructed you that if anyone was unwilling to work, neither should that one eat." So there's a pretty direct New Testament passage that says if you're not going to work, you shouldn't eat. So the net result is to allow the needy an opportunity to work for their own food and not to give it to them. Giving directly of the finished good would deprive them of the opportunity to work and the dignity and positive self-image associated with that. And here's my fourth principle. The needy had to be assertive enough to know when the timing is right to make their own harvest. Fallen grapes are not going to last more than a day or two on the ground. Grain left in the fields will not have an unlimited lifespan. So the needy had to know that there was a certain time when they could harvest what was left. The direction to the business owners is to make it available, while the needy need to be aware of when that happens and harvest it themselves. All right, so with that as some principles, let's try to take those principles and apply them to modern day situations. So I've got a few suggestions here for business owners wanting to incorporate these principles into their biblical businesses. It's difficult, of course, to make one-on-one connections. But if you're a service professional, like a CPA, a consultant, a doctor, a lawyer, etc., your commodity is time and expertise. So consider giving a small percentage of your time pro bono to people who come to you with needs you can fill but who are unable to pay the full fee. I believe that's an application for service professionals. For manufacturers, Consider dedicating a certain number of jobs within the plant to people who are otherwise unemployable. One of my clients, for example, has a contract with a local nonprofit to supply disabled workers who really would not find jobs otherwise. And they have a specific function. They rack parts to be coated. I think that's a great application. Think about giving excess raw materials or even overruns of finished goods to a nonprofit dedicated to creating employment for difficult to employ people. Distributors, consider creative uses for obsolete inventories. Is there some way that these could be used to create jobs? Rather than just selling it off at bargain prices, just think about obsolete inventories. And restaurants, take a little time and examine your procedures regarding excess food that might normally have been thrown away. Is there a way to get this into the hands of people who need it? And particularly, again, not finished meals, but raw materials. Now, regardless of your type of business, you could probably come up with some creative ways to impact the needy in your community. I think if you're guided by the principles of dedicating a small portion to the needy and providing an opportunity for work for those who are assertive enough to look for it. That's a starting point. Now, if you got some other ideas, feel free to share them in the comments section below. Okay? That's it. We're done. Bye-bye.